cold laugh echoes across a starfield, and it does more than carry mockery, it carries a question. Something out here, ancient and patient, has watched empires spin themselves thin. Tonight, 1,000 years of assumed mastery will be tested by a civilization that learned to turn scarcity into invention. Steel and doctrine will meet code and craft. What follows is not only a battle for survival, it's a lesson in how a species that knows it will die chooses to live. This is Sci-Fi HFY narrative, and this story begins where arrogance meets curiosity, where machines learn from myths, and where people decide that a laugh can be the first word in a very long conversation. If you love hard SF with a human heartbeat, subscribe now and hit the bell. Join us on the front lines of wonder and grit, where humanity echoes across the stars. The moment the transmission reached the bridge of the Kian flagship, silence became a weapon. Supreme Commander Zorac listened, every muscle in his many-limbed frame coiled like a taut cable. Across the void, a human Admiral Tessa Monroe smiled through the viewscreen and laughed. It was not contemptuous. It was a cold invitation to understand something Zorac could not name. Tessa's words were simple and dangerous. The 1,000-year treaty had expired. The Kian Empire's claim to all grievances meant nothing to a species that had spent its isolation learning to turn patience into power. Behind her public composure lay an entire civilization that had reimagined necessity as invention. Zorac heard the laughter again in his memory, and for the first time in 3 centuries, doubt braided with his anger. The Armada had been prepared for an easy conquest. Decades of conquest had taught the Kians that intimidation worked. They brought numbers, terror, and doctrine. The humans, for their part, had brought something else, a quiet confidence and an ecosystem of autonomous craft. The swarm, shaped by an urgency unknown to the Empire. On Zorac's bridge, officers argued about scouting and subterfuge. Some said the humans must be bluffing. Others, like Director Lura, admitted the gaps in their knowledge. Their surveillance had been limited by treaty constraints, their impressions fossilized by centuries of assumptions. Now those assumptions were cracking. Admiral Monroe's final line in the recording lingered. "When you come, bring something interesting." That invitation felt like a gauntlet thrown across the cosmos. The Armada glided through the silent reaches of the Sol system, like a predator approaching a sleeping herd. Zorac ordered formation and held the fleet's breath for impact. He expected lightning, panic, the scramble of a civilization facing annihilation. Instead, the Kian eyes met a system remade into a kind of cathedral workshop. Saturn's rings tore themselves apart not as calamity, but by design. What the Kian census had catalogued as ice and rock unfolded as engines and construction arms. Billions of craft slipped free and aligned into choreographed arrays. Human vessels, no larger than institutional shuttles, moved with a geometry that was breathtaking, a glittering storm that the humans called the Swarm. The first Kian salvo was textbook annihilation, synchronized megaton beams and plasma volleys designed to sterilize vector threats. The Swarm did not scatter. Their motion was not the reflex of biological pilots, but the refined ballet of autonomous minds trained for 3 centuries on Kian doctrine. The human algorithms had ingested every intercepted engagement profile available in their archives. The machines anticipated, intercepted, and adjusted with a cold, practiced precision. When 1,000 tiny craft slipped through a capital ship's defensive gradient and phased into its hull, the flagship's sensors registered something the Kian database had never been taught to expect. The hull dissolved at a molecular seam as if an invisible plane had walked through solid matter and unstitched it. Phase shift traversal was not theory, but applied art, a manipulation of matter's boundary conditions timed to quantum states. The Imperial Bridge watched in a stunned silence as 20 of their own vessels simply unstitched into the void. On the viewscreen, Admiral Tessa Monroe stood poised, more curator than conqueror. She explained that the Swarm had been training on Kian tactics for centuries, and that humanity's fabricators could spawn functioning vessels at prodigious rates. She offered a choice: a renewed treaty, measured in millennia, or a demonstration of human capability. Zorac's bridge split along old lines. Fleet Admiral decks seethed for escalation, convinced that overwhelming force would erase the humiliation. Director Lua counseled reconnaissance. Knowledge might be their deadliest weapon. Pride warred with a colder calculus. Survival. Beneath the tactics, engineers and economists recorded a deeper shock. The humans had turned exhaustion into architecture. Their distributed manufacturing, fast, local, and energy resilient, negated massive production hierarchies. If fabrication could draw matter from controlled energy fluctuations, resources and imperial economics would rewrite themselves. Then the demonstration arrived. Billions of small ships rotated in perfect synchronization to create a localized gravity anomaly. The Kian tactical nets registered a field where physics shouldn't have allowed it. The swarm momentarily folded inward and reconstituted a precise ring, a perfect echo of Saturn in miniature. It was not a weapon in the classical sense, it was a capability that made deterrence harder to maintain. Zorac, taught that retreat was a foreign word, tasted something like humility. He ordered a strategic repositioning, withdraw, preserve the armada, and reassess. The command tasted like metal and failure, but it was the correct choice. A small blue pulse was slipped into Kian custody by a human emissary on archive of human science, and with it, the weight of a choice. Continue the old song of conquest, or learn. The Kian homeworld received the armada in muted silence. Kia Prime's skies were orderly and indifferent to failure. The Empire had a long memory, and it remembered both victory and the cost of hubris. Zorac expected tribunals, public punishments, the ceremonial execution of a commander who had been bested. Instead, the High Council asked for explanation and then asked for learning. For months, Zorac dwelled in the slow work of self-critique. He oversaw studies into material-energetic conversion, quantum phase dynamics, and the computational architectures that had allowed the swarm to predict Kian tactics. Engineers pored over the blue pulse the humans had given him. Its surface shimmered with a complexity that made Kian data crystals feel like relics. Only one human had accompanied the gift, Dr. Jackson Webb, a tall, unadorned figure who walked into the council chamber without armor, like someone who trusted words more than banners. Webb's presence calmed and provoked in equal measure. He spoke of motives more than of technologies. He explained that humanity's rapid ascent had been less about a single secret and more about a cultural imperative, a civilization that had come to terms with mortality. For humans, the constant awareness of fragility had become a furnace for invention. They had built machines not only to dominate, but to ensure their species' continuance against a host of natural and metaphysical terrors. "You gave us space to grow," Webb said, in a voice like worn copper. "We used it to become dangerous, but not merely destructive. We made choices to automate, to decentralize, to make loss survivable. Our algorithms don't mimic us. They embody a human contract, preserve life by any lawful provisional means necessary." A murmur swept the council chamber. Kian elders had never framed innovation in moral terms. To them, utility and dominance were the same currency. To revalue invention as stewardship was destabilizing. Yet Dr. Webb's claim had data behind it. The blue pulse contained centuries of open-source science, simulated progressions, philosophical treatises, and what the humans had chosen to withhold, specific tactical schematics marked with conditional access. It was not charity. Webb's offer was a mirror and a challenge. The device presented the Kian Empire with 10,000 years of scientific scaffolding. How humanity had resolved energy conversion limits, how they had stabilized quantum states for phased traversal, the ethical frameworks guiding autonomous warfare. It did not hand over weapons. Humans preferred to require restraint as part of the bargain. The Kian scholars argued that this restraint was a culture's artifice, and that an empire built on conquest might never accept voluntary limits. Rankled by pride, many in the council favored retribution slow and precise. Some sought isolation, reshaping the empire's industrial might to compensate. Zorac proposed a different radicalism, leveraged defeat into curriculum. He urged the empire to shift resources from endless conquest to scientific renaissance. If the Kians could reorient their social prestige from the battlefield to the laboratory, they might survive whatever the humans had intimated was coming. The debate that followed was ferocious. Arch-Councillor Vexa, the empire's elder, spoke of legacy and continuity. Younger councillors argued adaptability. Economic ministers worried about the consequences. Entire caste systems rested upon conquest's spoils. Zorac, once praised for victories across 4 galaxies, found himself advocating for the postponement of campaigns he had once dreamed about. He argued for a long view. Extinction was worse than the sting of humiliation. In a narrow vote, the High Council ratified an experimental treaty. Limited cooperation, scientific exchange, cultural dialogue, and the repurposing of select military assets for defense architecture. It was not amnesty, it was a wager on mutual survival. Dr. Webb left with cautious optimism and a quiet warning about the anomalies the humans had studied. Out there, Webb told Zorac, our regions where light behaves strangely, where our physics flexes and folds. They devour possibility. We don't know their origin, only their pattern. They will require more than a single species. The Kian Empire could not yet see how human society had braided redundancy into habit. On Earth, neighborhood fabricators produced shelter in minutes. Decentralized computational nodes coordinated evacs without central command, and the swarm itself had been seeded with human stories and ethical training. The machines had been taught to prefer preservation. Their cause did not simply maximize damage, they optimized survivable outcomes. And then there was the human laughter that had unnerved Zorac. It wasn't derision. Laughter was ritualized defiance, a cultural valve that shrank fear's control. It signaled the species that had learned to meet inevitable loss by denying terror its dominion and by turning dread into action. Kian psychologists suspected mimicry would never reproduce the ritual. It took a set of life conditions for such a reflex to evolve. Cooperation rolled out imperfectly. Saboteurs tested the edges. A Kian warlord attempted to steer Hollow Ark blueprints toward armament. A human faction leaked protocols that forced Kian sensors into months of recalibration. But the treaty endured, because a third force rose, shared awe and shared dread. Probes reported corridors where light stalled, where ships lost coherence and instruments sang in unfamiliar registers. Stars beside those zones dimmed in strange ways, and absence, not heat. The phenomenon was not metaphor. It consumed complexity like rot consumes fruit, erasing organization, dissolving the scaffolding of life. Resources poured from fleets into labs. Young Kian engineers, once dazzled by rank insignia, competed in research programs that promised practical salvation. Human ethicists and Kian strategists drafted mutual frameworks to keep defense from becoming pretext for conquest. Learning together made both species less likely to die alone. One evening, Zorac stood on Kia Prime's viewing plaza, watching a pale manufactured ring Saturn's echo rotate under alien stars. The ring was a souvenir of defeat that had become a pivot. Admiral Monroe's smile, once infuriating, had become a compass. For the first time in his life, curiosity rose above hunger for renown. He had become, awkwardly, an apprentice to a civilization he had meant to subdue. Years folded into project cycles. The treaty's early fragility hardened into institutions, joint academies on neutral orbital platforms. The Kian word for honor gaining a suffix meaning research, and human communities opening fabricator hubs for Kian apprentices. The early experiments were modest microbeam stabilization, redundancy protocols for autonomous swarms, but their pace astonished traditionalists. Knowledge moved faster than policy, and policy tried to keep up. Zorac wore the badge of a visiting scholar as much as he wore ceremonial epaulet. He walked glass corridors where human students argued ethics with Kian. Victories of previous eras looked less valuable beside a single calculation that could preserve billions. The Allied program produced prototypes neither species could invent alone. The Hollow Ark was a mobile factory, a self-repairing lattice of materials and code that could bootstrap habitats from controlled energy. Arcology tutors were AI pedagogues that told the same origin stories to human children and Kian apprentices. Seeding shared narratives, and the gravity well stabilizer derived from synchronized swarm rotation and Kian geometry could locally modulate curvature for short bursts, granting the alliance a fragile foothold against strange topology. Social engineering became a science. Protocols for distributed governance and ethical meshes stained ambition with accountability. Humans taught Kian's ritual humility short ceremonies where leaders admitted error. Kians taught humans strategic patience delays that allowed heavy calculus to catch up with passion. Each exchange changed the other. Greed followed progress. A Kian old guard faction eyed the Hollow Ark as a covert armaments factory. Human extremists talked about a decisive first strike using phased traversal. Counterintelligence hunts flared. Zorac balanced vigilance and paranoia, trying to hold a fragile coalition together while hunting men or cells whose loyalty lay to empire rather than to survival. Dr. Jackson. Webb believed culture would be the ultimate defense. He argued for distributed guardianship, many small, independently governed nodes that could stabilize local spacetime without a single command center. Diversity of approach would be their hedge. Different heuristics, different contingencies, one shared mission. The first large field test arrived unexpectedly. A probe entering an anomalous corridor near the Piscine Ridge began to sing a chorus in the electromagnetic spectrum that dissolved the probe's matter signature. The environment altered cognitive processes inside processes, looping them into self-destructive patterns. Human coders and Kian physicists worked side by side, rerouting processes to analog fallbacks and designing physical heuristics that forced fragile systems to prefer survival over efficiency. They passed that test. But the victory tasted like ash. The anomaly had grown. Where once it rendered instruments mute, now it tried to reorganize matter into geometries that obeyed no topology they knew. The Hollow Ark deployed to stabilize a lattice. Engineers watched curvature regulate as the device traced counterpoints in spacetime, watching strange fingers of geometry bulk. On the Ark's observation deck, Admiral Monroe watched with quiet fury. She had become both symbol and operator, sometimes diplomat, sometimes field commander. In a moment for the cameras, she stepped unarmored into the maintenance bays to speak to a Kian repair crew. She listened, and the crew took heart. Her presence reminded every technician and strategist what they were fighting for. Life in all its messy, stubborn absurdity. Then the anomaly adapted. A sudden field fluctuation caused a localized phase inversion. A tethered research habitat winked free of existence. No wreckage remained. The loss became a quiet political weapon. The old guard used it to argue that cooperation endangered the Empire. Hybrid parties used it to demand faster safeguards. Public grief hardened into resolve. Memorials grew in human settlements. Quiet data altars rose in Kian halls. The losses were not merely tragic, they rewired policy. The Council approved an early warning lattice, a distributed network of Hollow Arks seeded along anomaly corridors. Each node would be self-sustaining, able to locally stabilize spacetime and broadcast early warnings. Zorac and Monroe oversaw the first deployment together, a symbolic union of histories. As the first arc unfurled, analysts picked up a distant, patterned signal. It was not noise, it bore repetition and structure. In the lab, instruments translated cadence into provisional waveforms that hinted at deliberate modulation. Someone called it a signature, someone else, a voice. Whatever watched the void was learning to answer. When the signature repeated, the Ark and Kian arrays fell into attentive silence. The waveform was pattern deliberate, not random. It suggested testing. Admiral Monroe convened a compact team. Zorac, Dr. Jackson Webb, human coders, and senior Kian physicists. Their response had to aims be comprehensible and be survivable. They would speak of life and offer proof of creation. They encoded a simple, layered reply, demographic maps, songs, images, and a microecology assembled by fabricators. The message mixed story and mathematics. Human narratives supplied context. Kian formula supplied precision. The broadcast was cautious invitation, and diagnostic hours bled into a fragile rhythm. Teams translated metaphor into matrices and melody into fabricators spun tiny ecosystems into being. The anomaly answered with a structured puzzle whose instability risked collapse. Solving it required human intuition and Kian patience in tandem. They paired coders with theorists, empathy with calculus. When the stabilizing modulation was found, the lattice shifted from hostile geometry into an ordered pocket brief, luminous and strange. The act did not erase peril. The anomaly adapted, increasing complexity and pushing new tests. Still, replying with creation instead of force changed the dynamic. The entity began to treat them as makers rather than mere nutrient. That shift bought time and, crucially, understanding. Across both worlds, people mourned who were lost earlier and honored their memory by accelerating safeguards. The Hollow Ark program multiplied into a lattice of stabilizers. Joint memorials, human vigils, and Kian data altar stood side by side, teaching both populations to carry grief without letting it calcify into revenge. In one quiet tableau, Monroe and Zorac stood beneath the pale manufactured ring visible from Kian Prime. They had been commanders and now were stewards. They shared an image of fragile life, both species reeling from loss, both sharpened by purpose. Their duty was not to conquer the cosmos but to make themselves inconvenient to whatever hunted between the stars. Dr. Webb watched from the Ark's rim. thinking of the blue pulse and of how a laugh once dismissed had become the first word of a long conversation. The Alliance would not win by force alone. They would win by building responses that made consumption costly, stabilizers, distributed fabricators, and cultural circuits that taught machines and minds to regard life as investment. They would refine spread fabricators to remote colonies and train both code and culture to recognize and resist the patterns that devoured without thought, always. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Sci-Fi HFY Narrative for more hard SF, human-first tales. Dive into the comments, tell me which character moved you most and what you'd do in the Hollow Ark. Share, like, and watch another story next, where humanity echoes across the stars.